Morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to be with you today and our wonderful series, The Historical Tropes in Contemporary Anti-Semitism, brought to you by ISGAP. This seminar has 4 distinct elements. We expect the people to be very, very elucidated in not only a series of problems, but how we can work together to promote solutions where possible. The seminar series brings out the perennial patterns in the phenomenon of anti-Semitism to shed light on the matter of why exactly is anti-Semitism referred to as the longest hatred. The aim of the series is fourfold. First, to elucidate the millennial themes and the variations on those themes that bring out the essence of anti-Semitism. Second, to expose and explain why the phenomenon is at once ancient and modern. Third, to impart a deeper understanding of how what was once the scandal of anti-Semitism morphs into a fashionable anti-Semitism today. And lastly, to enable the participants in the seminar to recognize the phenomenon in all of its subtle manifestations and to seek ways of responding to it. The themes to be examined include the anti-Semitic appropriation of the truth, of the blood libel, of the purity of blood, of the drive for redemption or salvation, the invisible and ubiquitous evil ascribed to the Jews, and much more. This seminar series will bring out the implications of theological and ideological tropes of anti-Semitism, both historical and contemporary. And in the end, the series will situate contemporary anti-Semitism within the eternal context of ethical demands and imperatives. It will pose the ethical questions that implicate each of us who encounters the phenomenon, the questions put to the firstborn of the first human. Where is your brother, and what have you done? It is a wonderful honor today for me to introduce one of our most prolific scholars and activists, Professor Gilroy. Professor Troy is a distinguished scholar in North American history at McGill University, currently living in Jerusalem. Gil is also an award-winning American presidential historian and a leading Zionist activist. In the foreword to Troy's recent book, The Zionist Ideas, Visions for the Jewish Homeland, Then, Now, and Tomorrow, Natan Sharansky writes, the magnificent work is a perfect follow-up to Arthur Hertzberg's classic, The Zionist Idea. Combining, like Hertzberg, a scholar's eye and an activist's ear, Gil Troy demonstrates that we now live in a world of Zionist ideas with many different ways to help Israel flourish as a democratic Jewish state. He has recently been designated the Allgemeine J100, among them of the top 100 people positively influencing Jewish life today. We welcome Professor Gil Troy. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. And I want to honor your important work and the important work of ISGAP, this incredible network. I've been a fan of Charles Small since we first met at the Global Forum Against Anti-Semitism many, many years ago. And I have some connection with your esteemed chairman, Natan Sharansky, who is so incredibly proud of all the important work that you do. And I'm a bit of an outlier in this conversation today, given the topic that I have, because I'm not speaking so much about good old-fashioned anti-Semites. And unfortunately, we have far too many of them. And I'm well aware of how many excellent experts you have on that awful, and I think you hit the nail on the head, quite fashionable phenomenon. But I want to look at it from a different perspective. And this is based on an article that Natan and I wrote over the summer about the un-Jews. And I want to, in addition to making the argument today, I really want to bring you into our thought process. And I feel a little presumptuous speaking in Natan's name, but I'll do it anyway. That's what happens when you're writing partners. And I want to do it as a way of really trying to raise issues of what we were trying to do, what our strategy was, for people to also come and say, you know what, that worked or didn't work, to share some of our thought processes and what we think are some of the implications of this argument we were trying to make and why we were making it. And ultimately, when we're talking about anti-Semitism, unfortunately today, we have to talk about not just anti-Semitism, but anti-Zionism, as you well know. But we also have to talk about the enablers. We also have to talk about, and I'll get to this later, about the acid rain that's generated sometimes within our own community that creates a greenhouse effect that, even if it's not explicitly anti-Semitic, is first of all not solving the problem, not leading in this important fight that so many of you are involved with, so many of us are involved with, but also is making it worse. And so that's the general introduction. I'm going to share screen and hope that it works. And I'll be very happy, of course, to hear questions, comments afterwards. Let me start with a slideshow. And is everybody seeing the slideshow? Yes? Okay. So, and really, we're going to look at this from the ideological, psychological, but also the sociological perspective, because what are we really talking about? When we talk about this epidemic on campus today, and I was talking to Professor Cannon at the beginning, and I said, you know, look at me, I'm a case, like so many of you, of arrested development, right? We got to university, freshman year or senior years, at some point we said, hey, I like this, I don't want to leave. I love this life of the mind. I love this opportunity to learn from other people. I love this opportunity to sharpen my skills, sometimes by disagreeing, not just by agreeing. And I love the mission of challenging the next generation to think independently and to watch our universities turn into propaganda factories. And not surprisingly, to watch those propaganda factories target the Jew and the collective Jew, Israel, has really been one of the great disruptions of my life, one of the great traumas of my life, and one of the things that really changed my direction from focusing very happily on American history in the most objective way I could, to still doing that, but also running this second career as being a Zionist loudmouth or activist, or you fill in the blank. Let's go back to May 2021. Even before the bombs started dropping right here in Israel, and I'm speaking to you from Jerusalem, the ideological hits were already coming from the American Jewish community, from leaders within the American Jewish community. And you'll notice I really try to avoid personalities. I really try not to use names. I'll be very happy if anybody wants the exact citations afterwards to do that. My email is my name, giltroy@gmail.com. But I think there's so much ugliness, there's so much name calling in the community. That's not what we're about. And that's not what you guys are about. So on Yom Yerushalayim, a leading, very well-known, prominent rabbi in Los Angeles posts this on Facebook, saying that this year we've been especially concerned as a group of extremists, Lahava, that is now the backing of Jewish supremacists recently elected to the Knesset, inflamed tensions. And this morning, the violence spread to Al-Aqsa Mosque. Now, Hamas and other terrorist organizations are targeting Israeli civilians. Now, we could spend the entire hour just on this text, right? We're especially concerned about that. But in her entire Facebook post, there's no special concern about what Israelis who are targeting are going through. Using this phrase, and we're going to come back to it again and again, Jewish supremacist, I would say, why don't you just be honest and use it in the initial German, in the original German? Because it's a phrase that comes straight from the Nazis. I know we're so anxious, and we'll get to this too, to jump on the white supremacist bandwagon. But really, Jewish supremacists? And by the way, I'll put my politics out there. I was appalled by the election of Ben Gvir, and I fought against it, and I wrote against it in the Jerusalem Post. But there are so many words I could use to criticize him, I wouldn't use the phrase Jewish supremacist. And then, in this age of Corona, we should be very sensitive to this. The violence spread to Al-Aqsa. No one has agency when the violence spreads, right? These people are innocents. Similarly, now Hamas are targeting Israeli civilians after a whole chain of Israeli abuses, about which I'm especially concerned. Now Hamas has no choice but to start bombing. It annoyed me, but I wouldn't call that woman an un-Jew. I would call her an annoying Jew. Then, that's a West Coast rabbi. This is an East Coast rabbi. In a filmed sermon, because of course so many sermons these days are filmed, and I want to emphasize she read it. Why is it significant that she reads it? Because unlike today, where I'm speaking extemporaneously, and we know when we lecture and we speak extemporaneously, sometimes we might use language that's a little inopportune, a little sloppy. We're riffing. Erwin Kotler, the great Canadian human rights activist, says that every time you give a speech, you give three speeches. There's the speech you intended, there's a speech you actually give, and then there's a speech you walk away going, damn, I should have said this, darn, I should have said that. Anyway, this is Red. And she talks about this country that I love. But she also characterizes that country that she loves as a country in which the government and the will of the people categorically discriminates, ethnically cleanses, and cares little for the basic human rights of millions of people that live under its administration. But of course is very careful to say, oh, but let's refrain from judging too harshly. I don't know. When I read that, I felt judged very harshly, especially because by now, this is Shabbat, the bombs have been falling and hit Tel Aviv and hitting Ashkelon and hitting Jerusalem and killing people, including the first victim, an Israeli Arab driving with his 16-year-old daughter, whom I just call a fellow Israeli, a fellow citizen, a fellow human being. I don't designate him as innocent and the rest of us as not, but we'll talk about that in group therapy afterwards. Still, hasn't crossed the line. And then 100 liberal rabbinical and cantorial students who are going to be leading the Jewish community, who are going to be setting the tone in 80% of the Jewish community in America for the next 20, 30, 40 years. Sign this appeal to the heart of the Jewish community. And of course, I have to connect to George Floyd. I have to make this false analogy. This is where it's psychological and sociological, not just ideological, to the racial reckoning. Because how else can I feel good about myself? And if American Jewish institutions have been asking, how are we complicit with racial violence, with racist violence? These students are so upset that they're not these same institutions, and obviously those primitive Israelis, are not reckoning racially with the abuse of power and racist violence erupting in Israel and Palestine. And they denounce Israel's violent suppression of human rights and apartheid in the Palestinian territories. These students speak about the return of Zion, but even when they explain the return to Zion, their history is so shoddy, is so superficial, they describe the land as full of human beings who didn't ask for new neighbors. I wanted to send every one of them a copy of my book, The Zionist Ideas, to explain to them what really happened historically, but we didn't have a budget for it. Even leaders from the far left in the American Jewish community who run those institutions, from Hebrew College in Boston all the way to the American Jewish University in Los Angeles, felt compelled to take to the newspapers. And if you smell some of the articles, you could see that some of it was donor driven, and it was a panic because they were obviously getting, say, wait a minute, you lack empathy for our own people. I won't even take issue necessarily with some of the things you've said, but your tone, your lack of love for the Jewish people, your lack of concern. Even that didn't cross my line. I'm unfortunately used to it, this story about what's going on with American rabbis, American, I should say, Reform, Conservative, and Reconstructionist rabbis. No, I should say some, not all, Reform, Reconstructionist, and also New Age rabbis, has been building for a long time. And so, you know, we have this outrage exhaustion, and we've been desensitized to it. So that didn't alarm me. The two things that alarmed me and Natan, and we're talking about this daily, of course, were these two missives. One, from the CUNY Jewish Law Students Association, and by the way, I verified that it's an actual statement, but it was taken down because there was such a harsh backlash against it. They very clearly declare their unconditional support for the Palestinian people in their fight for liberation and self-determination. Once again, use that phrase, hijacked, stolen, taken from Bosnia to ethnically cleanse the region. And they describe Zionism as the establishment of a Jewish ethno-state and the expulsion of Palestinians from their lands, a violent political ideology. The new expression used to just be called imperialist. Now we're being called settler colonialist, that erases Palestinians from existence, despite the massive growth of the Palestinian population. And then we get the words ethnic cleansing, apartheid, atrocities. And then that lovely phrase again, ideology of Jewish supremacy. And what really sent Natan over the edge was from the river to the sea. Because a Palestine, a free and just Palestine from the river to the sea, basically means there's no room for us. It is genocidal. It is exterminationist in its implications and in its vision. And now we're starting to talk. We want to do two things. We want to have a shot across the bow. We want to push back. But we also, why? Because we want to have a clear red line of what is acceptable and what is unacceptable. This from Chicago-based. This is for Ellen Cannon, because home base. Ethnic cleansing is not my Judaism. But then what really set us over the edge, and what really distinguishes the CUNY statement, the CUNY law statement, and this statement from all the others, was a statement from over 200 scholars of Jewish studies and Israel studies. Now remember, and many of you I'm sure are part of the associations, you know the origins of the Jewish Studies Association, when Jewish studies didn't count as anything serious. And you know the origins of the Israel Studies Association in reaction to MESA, the Middle East Studies Association. And I think part of the reason why Natan and I reacted so emotionally to this one in particular was because despite thinking that we've been following what's going on in American campuses, we missed what's going on in Jewish studies and particularly in Israel studies. That wokeness has overtaken that group too, increasingly. And I know there's a fight, but we were shocked that you could get 200 experts to acknowledge the Zionist movement as a diverse group of linked ethno-nationalist identities. We see this ethno-nationalist settler colonial paradigms, assumed a hierarchy of civilizations, and condescendingly approached the underdeveloped territory, thinking that they're going to bring an unqualified good. But the worst paragraph was this paragraph, which uses the phrases, again, Jewish supremacy, ethno-national, discrimination, violence, and the Palestinian population displaced. And we're going, what is going on here? First of all, this clump of cliches wouldn't pass my freshman composition class. Second of all, if you're going to take the combined brain power of 200 Jewish studies professors and Israel studies professors, don't you think they could come up with something a little more creative? Don't you think they could come up with something a little more fresh? Why is it, this again gets to the sociological and psychological, that they need to take these rehashed terms and recycle them and impose them? And we know as historians how careful you have to be about false analogies, how intellectually violent it is to take phrasing from South Africa, from Bosnia, from the American South, from the contemporary United States, and impose it. And in fact, you know what it is? It's cultural imperialism. Think about it. What's really going on is many of our best and brightest, our students, now we're talking within the Jewish community, our rabbis, our Jewish studies professors, our Israel studies professors, are not coming up with a fresh vocabulary, which frankly might be helpful to critique Israel, might be helpful to illuminate some of the blind spots that Zionism had. I'm never going to claim that Zionism is perfect or that Israel is perfect. It's the work of what we say in Hebrew and Jewish ideas, B'nai Adam, of human beings. We're all imperfect. But to use this kind of delegitimizing language, this kind of demonizing language, this kind of language which comes from the double standards, Natan Sharansky's 3Ds, was, dare I say it, triggering and deeply dismaying. But it really isn't. It's worth holding the thought a little bit. Why this need to fit Judaism, which predated Christianity, which predated Western thought, into this box? Why the need, again, sociological, cultural, ideological, to fit the Zionist story, which is not a colonialist story because we're returning to our land. It's not a white story because we know that there are light-skinned Palestinians and dark-skinned Israelis, and that over 50% of Israelis are dark-skinned. And Natan never likes making that point because he said it implies that somehow whiteness is evil. There's a say, oh, no, we're not white. You see what we're doing? We're buying into the notion that if, God forbid, we were all white, or those of us who are white are somehow evil or implicated. So look at all the distortions packed in to that. I mean, God bless them. They're very efficient in their cliche-ridden few words. But couldn't they be a little more creative? Couldn't they be a little more challenging? And again, I'll be happy to share the link. Look, the leading lights of Jewish studies and Israel studies signed that petition. And so now we're starting to talk. But we have a problem, or at least what looks like a problem. Our friendship, our collaboration, and sometimes our sparring partnership emerged in writing this book, Never Alone, which is Natan's memoir of what he calls 999, my 9 years in Gulag, my 9 years in Israeli politics, my 9 years in Jewish agency. I don't know where I suffered most, and I apologize for my bad Russian accent. And that was actually the structure of the book, 999, and remains the structure. We originally signed a book contract, 999, but then I didn't like it because it was an inside joke. I worried about 999 being 666. To some people look at it upside down and thinking of the devil. My German friends might think 999. And thanks to our friend David Suisse in the Jewish Journal of Los Angeles, we came out with this amazing title, Never Alone. For 3/4 of a century, we've been obsessed with Never Again, and we honor our Holocaust heroes and martyrs. But now, when you're part of the Jewish people, you're never alone. So what's the dilemma? If we stood up for Jewish unity, and Natan's whole life has been about Jewish unity, how do we take on these critics? But in fact, if you're truly going to have Jewish unity, if you're truly going to have Jewish peoplehood, my friend Danielle Hartman wrote an extraordinary book about boundaries and community. Every community, by definition, has boundaries. And so we're starting to say, wait a minute, in order really to protect our vision of a big tent, like Abraham's tent, left, right, open on all sides, we also have to have some red lines. And we start banding about this phrase, un-Jews. And I'll be honest, I'm a little uncomfortable with it because I know that Natan is a Jewish treasure. And I don't want to see all the work that he's done. I've done in my small part, but really, how much Natan has done to build bridges and to be a model of unity. And are we going to ruin that currency? Are we messing with the coin of the realm? And Natan is struggling with the term too. It's awkward. Does it work? And then the two quotations that convince it for us, but particularly for him, are one, remembering what Rosa Luxemburg said in 1917 when her friend was mourning the pogroms. She said, why do you pester me with Jewish troubles? I feel closer universally to the wretched victims of the rubber plantations. I have no separate corner in my heart for the ghetto. And as someone who lived Russian history, but also knows his Russian history, when we start thinking about the Everskaya, and I apologize for my bad pronunciation, the Jewish section of the Communist Party, we start realizing there's a historic pattern here. And so we write this article, The Un-Jews. And the idea of the article is to very clearly draw a clear red line and say, those first two rabbis, they're not un-Jews. Annoying, inappropriate, a little bit lacking in empathy, like the rabbinic students, but they're not un-Jews. Because they're still, to a certain extent, within the framework of accepting peoplehood and accepting the connection of peoplehood and statehood, which has been the fundamental Jewish consensus for identity building since the Shoah, certainly since 1948, and even more so since 1967. We can talk about that historic move later. So who are the un-Jews? The un-Jews are those who are leaders, Jewish studies professors, Israel studies professors. And one of the things I'm thinking about, and one of the things that's motivating us, is we're going, oh my goodness, what's it like to be a Zaidi, a Bubby, who's paying $15,000, $20,000, $30,000 a year to help subsidize their precious Bubbla's tuition, because we know how crazy college tuitions are. And so they say, oh, you know what, make me happy, take a Jewish studies professor, take a Jewish studies course, take an Israel studies course. And instead of having an outstanding leader and thinker and critical thinker like our convener today, Professor Cannon, they get one of these people who insidiously use phrases like Jewish supremacy, who are undoing that core consensus, that link between Israel and Zionism and Jewish identity that we see has spoken so powerfully to the birthright population, that has worked, and that has been working in so many ways. And we say we call these critics un-Jews because they believe that to fulfill the Jewish mission, one side of the mission, the universal mission of saving the world, they have to undo the ways most Jews do their Jewishness. They're not ex-Jews because they're still deeply involved. They're not non-Jews because they're Jewish leaders. They're not, to take that phrase from England, as a Jews who only pop up as Jews when they want to defend, when they want to attack Israel. So they're un-Jews because they're undoing and they're insidiously within. And think of how many millions of Jewish dollars have gone in to their professorships and their fellowships and go into their pockets to then turn on the Jewish people. And we didn't want to use the phrase self-hatred, partially because it's a tired phrase, but partially because I'm not there to psychologize. I'm there to say, look at the impact of what you're doing. And to look at the historical, we could smell the historical trail, not just among the Soviet communists, those Jews who led the fight to purge the Judaism from the Soviet Union, not just Rosa Luxemburg and the Marxists who, despite loving humanity, had no room in their heart for Jews. It goes back to the Second Temple, and who we call the first un-Jew, Tiberius Julius Alexander, the nephew of the leading Jewish philosopher Philo, who led in the destruction of Jerusalem. And we looked at some of the leaders of the disputation in Barcelona and Tortosa, attacking from within. That's what the un-Jew is doing. And we were very careful to say, this isn't about criticism of Israel. This isn't about being pro-Palestinian. This isn't about all the phrases that we talk about, hugging and wrestling and daring to ask hard questions or giving Israel tough love. Those were the first three rabbis and rabbinic groups whom we didn't attack. This is about joining those people who are trying not only to eviscerate us, but even worse. Let's be honest. Most of my friends in Israel here don't really worry about what's going on campus, and don't really worry about anti-Semitism. They worry about the enemies at the gate, whom our kids have to defend against. The greatest victims of this ideological assault on Israel and the Jewish people, the greatest victim of the anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, the greatest victims of what Judeophobia calls Zionophobia on campus today are the next generation of young Jews. Those are the ones whose dreams are being robbed. Those are the ones who are being forced to be defensive. Those are the ones who are in distress psychologically, sociologically, and ideologically. And for these un-Jews leading the Jewish community, living off the Jewish dole, to absorb the wokeness without any thought, any creativity, and a lot of viciousness was what was for us so dismaying. And I get it sociologically. Let's say I'm a medieval Jewish historian. I don't have enough room on my earlobes, no matter how big, to put enough earrings in to make me look cool. I don't have enough skin on my arms to tattoo myself enough to look hip. I'm automatically out, uncool. But if I join the pile-on against Israel, boom, go to the head of the class. Boom, I'm going to get those research grants that I need. Boom, I'm going to be popular. I call these the new Galut Jews. And I call their Israeli brothers and sisters the new Galut Jews, because they know how do they get the European research grants? By bashing Tel Aviv University and Beersheba University and calling it to be boycotted, even though they work there. Now, in terms of our concern here today, so this isn't traditional anti-Semitism. So what's the phrasing that I could use to kind of characterize the harm they're doing? So I thought maybe of a hostile environment, that they're contributing to the hostile environment, but I don't want to use that phrase because I think it's really important that we hold that phrase that I'm borrowing consciously from the women's movement to talk about what our students are experiencing on campus and to call out those people who have zero tolerance for microaggressions against everybody else, but allow all kinds of macroaggressions against Israel Jewish students. So I think that's why, and I call that, by the way, educational malpractice, but that's for a whole other conversation. So hostile environment, maybe enablers, because these are Jews, these are Jewish experts, these are Israel studies experts who are enabling. But if today I want to share with you my latest thought, which is to go to my environmental friends and say, what are they doing? Jewish supremacy, ethno-nationalism, river to the sea. They're generating more smog. And by the way, giving it, to mix my metaphors, a kosher stamp, a kosher asmachta. And in doing so, what are they doing? They're really triggering acid rain, because they generate the smog that joins the other smog. That creates the rain. And what does it do? It creates the greenhouse effect. And this is what our students are suffering from, a negative anti-Semitic greenhouse effect. So I'm not going to call any one of those people who signed that letter, I'll call them sloppy scholars, I'll call them uncreative, I'll fail them in my freshman writing course, but I won't call them anti-Semites, I'll call them self-hating. But I will say that they're enablers, and I will say that they are adding to this environmental degradation. And so they're not only not solving the problem, but they're adding to this greenhouse effect that students of ours are suffering from, especially after May. And I have to say, in the back of my mind is the very powerful assessment of Zev Jabotinsky when testifying before the Palestine Royal Commission, when he talks about the anti-Semitism of things, the inherent xenophobia of the body social. And so these people have not only failed to fight the anti-Semitism of things, which has now worked its way into the academic woodwork, into those fine, beautiful, wood-paneled rooms that gave me such inspiration as an undergraduate and as a graduate student, as a professor. They're not only not doing the work that needs to be done to cleanse it, but they're adding to it. Before I open for questions, let me just give you a little bit of a taste of the reaction we got. So in the Times of Israel, this fellow Jerusalemite fires Natan Sharansky, calling him an unhero, which was, when I first got it, I was, oh my goodness, this is exactly what we feared. But one of my friends put it very cleverly. He said, you know, when I looked at the reaction that you got from the un-Jews, it proved that you were right. They were far more upset about the spuriously argued piece that we wrote in Tablet than they were about the 99-year-old Holocaust survivor who lost her legs in the bombing and in fact just died yesterday. The people who were killed, the people who were traumatized, they had no room in their hearts for that, but they were, oh my goodness, you would have thought that we had that we had come and we had fired them and we had canceled them. It was the most divisive piece he had read in years, demonizing and representing fellow members of people that he has championed for decades. And then what he does is he does exactly what we were very careful not to do. He claims that that what we're trying to do is we're trying to demonize anybody who criticizes, when we're actually doing the opposite. And then Shaul Magid, without using our names, by the way, and I appreciate that, and I only use his name because it came from an article, accuses us of being the enforcers. Now, I love this because this is one of the great things, that we're the gatekeepers, that we're the police. He also calls us, right, the Zionist policing. This guy has a professorship at Dartmouth. He has a platform at the Shalom Hartman Institute. Every time he wants to write something, I see his name and by the way, I love the guy. He's a very charming person. I would see his work in Tablet, and I see his work here and there, but he's being policed, right? And then that's the first move. The second move is to accuse us of bullying, to accuse us of trying to clamp down the conversation, as opposed to what we're trying to do is draw some red lines. And then what he and so many others do is say, wait a minute, you don't even understand your Zionism. What about Ahad Ha'am? What about Hannah Arendt? What about Judah P. Magnus? And talk about being ahistorical. They run they run quotes from Ahad Ha'am and Judah P. Magnus and all these people as if they know how those people might have reacted to a Shoah. As if they know how those people might have reacted once the state of Israel was accepted. As if maybe Judah Magnus had lived longer, had started processing the fact that no Arab ever joined up to his bi-national vision. So scholars, the best and the brightest, the most prestigious colleagues we have are distorting the conversation. It's ideological, it's psychological, but it's also sociological, and it's very dismaying. And I thank you for being leaders in the fight to make sure that this doesn't continue. And if it does, that we at least call these people out and make both the bubbies and the zadies, as well as the administrators and the professors and the students themselves aware, because we need a whole consumer movement to make our students careful and make the parents careful and make the administrators and the donors careful about the propaganda they're getting and the bullying they're going to be exposed to. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very, very much, Professor Choi, for that very important discussion that you have given us, and much to think about. I see that we have many questions, but I'm going to just ask my first question. You are a magnificent historian. You are an expert in everything about the extent to which assertions must be made and the documentation of that. And what we have watched, as you have really clearly explicated, is the transition of the collective Jew from that which is being oppressed historically with a huge history into now being, of course, the oppressor, the murderer, the ethnic cleanser, the belligerent, and so forth. One of the things that you have very importantly stated 4 times in your discussion is that the people who you call the un-Jews, that their history is shoddy. You also emphasized the absence of correct historical understanding of where this is coming from today. And so for those of us who are extremely supportive of your argument, it is very, very important that we're watching the inversion of truth, the inversion of reality, the inversion of morality of what we ask people to do. And so much of it is a product, especially not only of the Nazi and their propaganda, but of the Soviets' edification and further development of this propaganda, the role of international organization as an enabler, the role of NGOs as enablers, the role of people like we are watching very, very dangerous efforts of the Jewish Voice for Peace to take this explication by the Soviets and by Nazi propaganda and recycle it in ways which are so dangerous. My answer is, can we move in the right direction without restoring the importance of history in all forms of education, of the importance of documentation, of the importance of verification, of the movement away from knowledge now being the core goal is activism rather than edification, understanding to help humanity? How do we use history in K through 12 and the university level? How do we introduce its importance so that, again, the objective away from politicalization of this issue and so many others can be contained and then attempted to undermine this process? Can you address that?
Thank you for that. Yeah, it's an inversion and a perversion, as you were saying. I was saying it. So first of all, look, there's a fundamental issue here, which is what is the mission of the university? And a broader question, which is now being fought out in the United States of America, about what's the mission of education? What's the mission of civics? And we've actually seen in my time a shift from, I grew up in a world where most of my professors really believed that our mission as scholars was to seek the word that you use, that unfashionable word, the truth. And how do you do that? You reason forward, not backward. You don't start with your conclusion. You don't start with, oh, I really need to fit in with the woke faculty, and so I'm going to see how I can fit the Zionist story, the Israel story, the Jewish story into that artificial box. You start with the facts. You start with the reality. And you start with your assessment, and we know that no one person is objective, that people have that, but you try to achieve objectivity. That is the value. That is the goal. And Jonathan Sarna recently wrote a very important piece about this. I think it was in Sapir, about the disrespect for objectivity as a goal. And he was very careful not to overly romanticize the academics of a previous generation. But it really is a fundamental question. And I call on my liberal friends, as well as my conservative friends, to have that necessary conversation about what is the goal of the university. And I call on my fellow parents, because I also sent my kids to, most of my kids served in the Army, but one kid served in the Army and also went to University of Chicago, and we got the tuition bills. You're consumers. And, you know, when I went into university, I said that it's the great con. The great con is that we, parents and students, are paying top dollar for the best, what we think are the best teachers, and they're actually being hired as the best scholars. Today, the great con is that we think as consumers that we're buying the best professors, meaning teachers and scholars, and actually we're buying propagandists. And you can actually see even in academic handbooks, some of the academic handbooks of departments of the history profession have changed and have said this is political. So we have to start reasoning forward, not backward. But more than that, we have to have a broader conversation about this. We're not having a conversation about it. We allowed this hijacking to occur silently, and idiot parents continue to write the big checks, not just the $50 or $60 or $70,000 to elite universities and the 10, 20, 30,000 to state universities, but also the bigger checks, the multi-million-dollar checks as donors, and no one's asserting that. And the second piece, and this would be Natan's contribution to the conversation, is that you can smell the Marxism.
Absolutely.
Marxism reduced everyone to the oppressor and the oppressed. Binary. There's no room for for deviation. There's no room for diversity. There's no room for complexity. There's no room for subtlety. And that same model is now being applied to whites, blacks. That's why we have to be whites. And the facts be damned. And we have to call that out too, because it's toxic. And you say K through 12, one of the things I'm starting to see, I wrote this 3 years ago, right before the lockdown. And now I said, beware, look what's happening in high schools. And I was wrong. It's not only happening in high schools, it's happening in elementary schools. And increasingly we see teachers who were very mission driven, who were coming to serve as propagandists. And, you know, it's unfortunate to me. I'll be political. I'm not getting any money from you guys. I'm here as a volunteer and I'm speaking my mind and speaking my truth. It's unfortunate that Donald Trump jumped on the 1619 bandwagon, because now when thoughtful liberals like Sean Wilentz or Gordon Wood criticize the whole 1619 distortion of the broader distortion of history, they and I are immediately seen as Trumpian because everything's become binary. Well, there's a middle. I am unwoke, but I'm also anti-Trump. And we have to find, I call this the silenced majority. We have to start awakening that silenced majority to start being more effective consumers at the elementary school level, at the private school level, at the high school level, and at the college level.
Thank you very, very much. And again, we have some wonderful questions that I will now turn to. The first is by Jeremy. I will read his question in its entirety. Did Sharansky or Troy originally propose unJew? If Sharansky does it have anything to do with the highly credible accusations against him by thoroughly vetted Jewish Israeli actual Soviet refuseniks who marshaled much evidence supplied by Jewish political prisoners in the Soviet Union, as written up by the surgeon Yuli Nudelman in Sharansky Unmasked?
You know, I love a back and forth. I love critical inquiry. I love thoughtful questions. It takes a tremendous amount of gall to sit in judgment on somebody who spent 9 years in the Gulag. It takes a tremendous amount of gall to take very marginal lies that have been pulled back and refuted systematically and pretend that they're credible and they're mainstream. And it takes a real animus to libel a human rights hero like Natan Sharansky. And I can tell you that I worked on this book, Never Alone, with him for 3 years. I sat at the table with him. I sat at the table with Avital Sharansky. I saw that these, you know, and as a historian, I come with a lot of skepticism. As a historian, I know the first time I learned about Franklin Roosevelt, I learned that all gods have clay feet. And I'm used to being disappointed. But I'm not so disappointed because I don't have expectations. When you sit with Natan Sharansky, and as I did, for 2.5 weeks, and he explains to you what he endured in the Gulag and how he thought it through so I could try to render it.
I got lost here.
I'm still with you. When I sat there, in as we say in Hebrew, in a sichat of arbainayim, four eyes, 2 on 2, 1 on 1, heart to heart, talking about this, to start spreading those libels is really, to me, beyond the pale. But you have free speech, and I'm happy I had an opportunity. Actually, thank you, because you gave me an opportunity to refute it. And I'll say this, if you want, and I think if Natan was here, he would allow me to say this. It was originally my idea, the unJews. And it came to me in a jog. This is the way I think through my thing. And again, I was thinking about, and there's a paragraph that we have in the article which really explains the thinking. Ex-Jews, not. Non-Jews, no. Howard Jacobson's wonderful phrase, as a Jews, no. How do I explain it? Self-hatred, I don't want to go there. And I said, what are they doing? They're undoing this core consensus that Natan Sharansky and I and so many others have invested our entire life in trying to strengthen. They're trying to pull it apart. And so I came to him with the word unJews, and he was quite resistant to it, partially, again, as I was saying, the language, you know, he doesn't have the American ear. Would it work? He tried it out on a whole bunch of people as his wont, but it had nothing to do with this this kind of line of thought.
Excellent. Thank you very, very much. And I have been privileged for the last 2.5 years to work with and under the leadership of Natan Sharansky. And I couldn't emphasize the extent to which his contribution and his understanding of the issues of the historical development of what his experience has been, as well as the implications of the continued effort of such efforts, has been a massive contribution to the study of contemporary anti-Semitism. One of the main concerns that we find as scholars is that when we're looking at contemporary anti-Semitism, much of the public does not understand that when Israel is criticized in the manner it is today, that the overall effort is to the extinguishing of a Jewish state. And even in the one-state solution, the goal is to eviscerate the content of that which is Jewish, to undo Jewish culture, history, traditions, language. What we are talking about is an explosion of the undoing of this enormously important culture that so many of us are deeply dedicated to. So what do you see the media's role in trying to assist the opposition, or how can we adjust the media's attention to the reality of what we are faced with the notion of Zionism equals racism, that Israel must be critically examined towards the delineation of an unworthy state to exist? Where do we begin with the media's role in all of this?
Well, thank you. Before I get to the media, I just want to say one thing as an academic. We wrote this article in Tablet. We wrote the article rather quickly, and it was very much not a scholarly article. The next step, and it was really like a thought piece, right? And it was kind of I said it was a shot across the bow, but it was a trial balloon. And the next step would be for us to write about it in a more systematic way. And so I just want to point out that some of my language was very much part of the language of the moment. And it was, all of us have different personalities and different writing personas. And we were very conscious of the fact that in that article, we were writing as activists. We stand by every single word, and I wouldn't change a word. But when you write in Tablet, a short article is very different than the kind of academic. If we were really going to go forward with it, the next step would be to do more thorough academic research. And that gets actually to the media question, because first of all, let's start off with the good news. Look at the Gallup poll about American attitudes towards Israel. Over the last 20, 30 years, as the media has gone up and down and said all kinds of things about Israel, it's been quite steady. 70 to 75% of Americans support the state of Israel. And even everybody loves to yell and scream and pull their hair out. This is why I once had a full head of hair, as did Natan, about how young Jews are abandoning us. Look at the recent poll study, the recent Pew study that showed that 83% of American Jews, which includes our young people, take pride in Israel and feel connected to Israel. And I've seen that in the eyes of birthright students. So things aren't quite as bad as they are. I think what we have to do with the media is twofold. One is retail and wholesale. Retail, I really think that there's a lot. I mean, we just saw this with the Whoopi Goldberg thing. I don't think Whoopi Goldberg is an anti-Semite. I wouldn't have suspended her for 2 weeks. I would have educated her, as I think Jonathan Greenblatt tried to do and others tried to do. I think there's a lot of ignorance. There was a brilliant Wall Street Journal article about this by Rebecca Sugar saying, what's the problem with what happened just now with Whoopi Goldberg? Why do we give these celebrities a platform? Why do we think that anybody who has a Twitter account or a TikTok account, or let alone even a television show, understands the Shoah or anything else? So we've created this world, and we as academics have to struggle with this. We've created this world of instant experts who don't know anything. Whoopi Goldberg was just talking, just shooting the breeze, and it happened to be with an audience of millions. So wholesale, we have to start having a conversation with the media about the harm that this is causing, about the greenhouse effect. This is why I'm trying to inject this language about acid rain. I'm trying to avoid also language of traitor and betrayal. I don't like that kind of language. I'm trying not to be so harsh. I'm just trying to say there's a problem here. There's a toxicity in the air. And look what you're doing. But we also have to retell one-on-one, start having conversations with people in the media, explaining to them what's going on, explaining to them the distortions, explaining to the harm this is causing, and explaining to them that there's a different story out there, and at least be open to the complexity. I always say when I speak on campus, back when travel was a verb and I could go, and I wasn't just Zooming, and even when I do it on Zooms, I say, if you walk away from me and say, hallelujah, I see the light, I'm nervous. Because somebody else is going to come up, they're going to be smarter than me, they're going to be more charming than me, they're definitely going to be better looking than I am, they're definitely going to be funnier than I am. And then you'll say, I see that light. I want you, and that's not why I wore the sweater, but I want you to see the grays. I want you to see the complexities. And that's what was missing in the Jewish studies professor's petition. That's what was missing in the CUNY studies, the CUNY petition. That was missing in the rabbinic study, racial reckoning. Complexity, messiness, embrace the messiness. And I stand by my tablet article and our tablet article, even though it was an academic article, because we embraced the messiness. There was subtlety there. There was nuance there. That's what we need in the media and in academia.
Thank you. I have a question here from Avi Gold. We thank you for your question. And I think this, we might be running out of time, but it's an excellent question. Question about definition. Would you place Herod Agrippa II in the same category as Philo's nephew? And if not, why not?
So thank you for the question. Look, in the world according to me, the next step would really be to have, if people think this is a valid phrase, and if it helps the Jewish conversation and helps the Jewish people, it would be to really hold an academic conference before I would even write that academic article, and have different experts from the classical period, from the medieval period, from the Soviet period, from American Jewry, give their analysis. And part of it would be us hacking out and hashing out and spending the time what we're supposed to do as scholars of what exactly is the correct definition. From my limited expertise as an American historian, and I need this because I admit my main training is an American historian. I had kind of a second PhD in Zionist history, but I'm not a classicist, right? But my sense is, and one of the things we'd want to play with the un-Jews, and we were pushing the edge with the disputation, because at what point did they become Christians rather than Jews, right? And at what point did they, by converting, buy into a different theology, and so they're not like the un-Jews who continue to host Shabbat dinners as Hillel directors or Jewish studies professors, right? And part of the thing, what we were trying to say was the un-Jew was someone who's really, really within. And we were really saying there are two dimensions to the un-Jew. One is truly, truly within and trying to undo this. And secondly, trying to undo this core consensus of peoplehood, statehood, and religion in the name of this higher universalism. So to the extent that Herod considered himself a Jew, he in fact would be an effective un-Jew. And to the extent that he also thought that he was advancing a higher ideal, a higher aesthetic, a higher Roman ideal, he fits into our model. And in fact, one of the most constructive emails I got was from a colleague at Yeshiva University, who said, first of all, he said, boy, did you nail it? He said, we in the Jewish studies world can't even talk about this stuff anymore because the bullies are running the conversation. And he said, yeah, you know, perhaps stretching. And so that ultimately would be my invitation to others. Help us out. Give us feedback. giltroy@gmail.com is my email. Is this a useful phrase? Is it not a useful phrase? Does it help illuminate the conversation? Does it help draw boundaries? Does it help give our students some tool to distinguish between those people with authority who are reasoning backwards from wokeness and those people with authority who are seeking truth? That was the goal. That was the attempt. And because we felt that it was an emergency, we chose the popular media to share it. And I hope that it's a helpful phrase, and I hope that it's not a destructive phrase, because our intention was certainly not to pour more fuel on the fire. Our attempt was to have a big, open, thought-provoking, critical and self-critical tent, but to invite our Jewish studies professors and Israel studies professors, use your expertise to come out with the kind of tools that I need as an Israeli citizen to advance the conversation. But to rehash these cliches only hurts the Jewish people and your own credibility. It only hurts our search for truth and our search for illumination and adds to the darkness. Thank you very much.
We thank you very, very much, Professor Troy, for your thoughtful and clearly passionate presentation with us today. And we also thank ISGAP for providing the insight and the wonderful examination tools that allow us to understand the roots of the traditional and classic anti-Semitism. It's seeping into a variety of forms of learning and politics today. And again, we hope that our listeners will join us for future presentations of our seminar series. Until then, everyone keep healthy and most of all, seek the truth and participate in the future well-being of the Jewish world. Thank you so much, Professor Troy.
Thank you. And thanks for all the great work you do.